that aid is being taken by Hamas and distributed exclusively to its terrorists. Boxes of humanitarian aid have been found in Hamas terror tunnels. So, if humanitarian supplies are not getting to where they should, point the finger at Hamas. Hamas is the genocidal terror organization that rules Gaza with an iron fist. Hamas violated the ceasefire on October 7th, and it was Hamas, not Israel, who violated the humanitarian pause. To Hamas, international humanitarian law holds no importance. When sitting in these meetings, it feels as if Hamas doesn't exist at all. It is always only about Israel. This is a distortion of reality, and it is unacceptable. Hamas must be held accountable. Mr. President, today is the first day of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, the Festival of Light. It is one of the Jewish holidays that celebrates the Jewish people overcoming attempts in each generation to destroy us. How world powers tried to deny our presence in our ancestral homeland, in Jerusalem, in the 2nd century BCE, before Jesus, before Muhammad. It is a holiday that celebrates how light prevailed over darkness. Today, sadly, we find ourselves again surrounded by darkness, with forces that seek to destroy us and also to demonize and delegitimize us. Jewish tradition teaches that even a little bit of light can dispel much darkness. Every one of you can use light to dispel the darkness and expose the truth. I pray that we see another Hanukkah miracle here in the UN, and that the Almighty will allow the truth and light to prevail here in this council. That we will see Hamas defeated soon, so that both Israelis and Gazans can live freely, free of violence and free of fear. Israel, Mr. President, will continue with her mission, the elimination of Hamas's terror capabilities and the return of all of the hostages. And we will complete our mission while supporting every humanitarian initiative to improve the situation for Gazans. Whoever truly seeks peace and security in the region must understand that the only way to achieve this is by destroying Hamas, not by calling for ceasefire, which will only extend the war and suffering of all. There is no other option. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Israel.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements.
Tiene la palabra.
I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Secretary General Antonio Guterres, thank you for your briefing. We are profoundly grateful for your steadfast moral leadership. By taking the rare step of invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter, you are compelling us to confront the enormity of the catastrophe unfolding in Gaza. It is our fervent hope that your demand is met. Mr. President, for 2 harrowing months, we have borne witness to the onslaught in Gaza. Israel's military operations has killed more than 16,000 Palestinians, 7,000 of them children. It has displaced 80% of the population and damaged or destroyed 60% of housing units. For context, this is a scale of destruction surpassing even the bombing of Dresden in 1945. For the many Gazans who have never left that narrow, besieged strip of land, their entire world is being systematically demolished before their eyes. The invocation of Article 99 must be a tipping point, a solemn reflection of the desperate plight in Gaza and the imperative need for the Council to act. The Council must act when too little aid is getting in and humanitarian workers are unable to deliver it for fear of being killed. The Council must act when the siege on Gaza is becoming a major source of death. The Council must act when unrelenting bombardment kills more than 130 UN staff members. Despite the recent temporary pause, the violence and danger to civilians has not abated. In fact, this conflict has now graduated to a new, more dangerous phase. The siege of Khan Yunis and other parts in southern Gaza, where hundreds of thousands of people have fled, has now begun. There is literally no safe haven for the millions of people trapped and under attack. Mr. President, in his letter, the Secretary General noted that Gaza's healthcare system, or what's left of it, is on the verge of collapse. Israel is warning the World Health Organization that unless it removed its medical supplies in southern Gaza, impending military operations will put them beyond use. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the deliberate targeting of medical facilities, equipment, and personnel. For our part, the UAE established a field hospital inside Gaza on December 2nd, with an operational capacity of 150 beds. We recognize that these efforts are not nearly enough. Even during the recent pause, we saw the need for an enhanced aid delivery mechanism to allow full, rapid, safe, and unhindered access. We need a streamlined monitoring system and an expanded capacity to deliver goods, including through the opening of further crossings and entry points. We note that Israel reportedly agreed to open the Karam Abu Salim crossing for inspections only, and while this should reduce the time delays, it remains necessary for all crossings to be opened and, if needed, repaired. We stress the importance of ensuring the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2712, which demands all parties to respect their obligations under international law and calls for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses. We underscore that members of this Council must ensure implementation, but we all know that the only way to end this tragedy is to impose an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. There is no defensible, moral, political, nor military justification for this carnage to continue. After 2 months of war, ambulances are delivering more dead than survivors to the few emergency rooms left functional in Gaza. Over the last few days, reports have revealed what precisely unfolded in northern Gaza. In the intensive pediatric care unit of an abandoned hospital, several babies lay dead, their bodies decomposing. Let that harrowing image haunt anybody persisting in the fantasy that the operation in the south will be any less horrific. It will not. Mr. President, this war has brought our region to a breaking point, but its effect has rippled far beyond. There has been an appalling increase in incidents of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia worldwide. The international system is teetering on the brink. For this war signals that might makes right, that compliance with international humanitarian law is dependent on the identity of the victim and the perpetrator. Mr. President, the Secretary General, every head of every UN agency, humanitarian organizations, and the overwhelming majority of the world's population have repeatedly called on members of this body to bring this unrestricted violence to a definitive and sustainable end. The UAE has circulated a draft resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to do just that. Today, this Council will vote. It will have an opportunity to respond to the deafening calls across the world to bring this violence to an end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for your statement, and I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to thank the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for the frank assessment of the catastrophic situation in the Palestine-Israeli conflict zone. We note his absolutely correct decision, given the current circumstances, to draw the attention of the Security Council to this matter under Article 9 of the United Nations Charter. We, together with colleagues from the People's Republic of China and the United Arab Emirates, guided by the same considerations as the Secretary General, requested the Ecuadorian presidency to convene an Emergency Security Council meeting in connection with the resumption of military operations both in the Gaza Strip and other occupied Palestinian territories, and in regions bordering with Lebanon and Syria. We believe it is exceedingly important to note that both the Secretariat of the United Nations, led by the UN Secretary General, and the overwhelming majority of UN member states are united in a desire to adopt decisive measures in order to end the deaths and suffering of civilians in the Palestine-Israel conflict zone. Distinguished colleagues, it will be no exaggeration to state that presently we are at a moment of truth. For nearly 2 months, we were told that what is most important, what is most pressing, what is most urgent that the Council needs to do is to call for humanitarian pauses. We were told that this, unlike a ceasefire, is allegedly an achievable and a realistic goal. As for the questions that were posed regarding how this call will be implemented, the response we received was that humanitarian agencies on the ground will deal with it themselves. Well, it is time to take stock. Humanitarian pause did indeed take place. However, this humanitarian pause had nothing to do with Security Council Resolution 2712. This pause and the release of several dozen hostages and Palestinian prisoners were the result of an agreement between regional mediators and Hamas and Israel, compliance with which naturally was not overseen by anybody. Nor did this humanitarian pause have any political significance. The parties indeed gained a respite. They achieved their tactical objectives, and subsequently Israel, with the proactive support of the United States, transitioned to a new, even more violent phase of its ground operation in Gaza. I wish to quote some passages from yesterday's letter from the Secretary General. Civilians throughout Gaza face grave danger. The healthcare system in Gaza is collapsing. Hospitals have turned into battlegrounds. There is no effective protection for civilians. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. Amid constant bombardment by the IDF, I expect public order to completely break down soon, rendering even limited humanitarian assistance impossible. End of quote. Colleagues, these are the real fruits of Resolution 2712, all of the protracted discussions at the Security Council, which unfortunately are increasingly reminiscent of empty words merely. Today, Antonio Guterres has once again set out the situation. UN humanitarian organizations under these circumstances simply cannot help the residents of Gaza. We deeply regret the fact that the Security Council, which has a uniquely potent instrument under Article 7 of the UN Charter, in all of this time failed to take any clear, binding resolution with demands, not calls, for the parties to end violence. Under pressure from the United States, which has threatened to block any other product, an absolute imperative for a ceasefire was replaced with a call addressed to no one in particular, which is for pauses which cannot be enforced, which essentially dovetailed with the Israeli approach of continuing military operations in the enclave. This became a major step backwards as compared to the General Assembly resolution overwhelmed by the majority of states on 27 October. Today, the Council has a good opportunity to end this abnormal situation, to do what the international community expects of it. To that end, there's a need to adopt the draft resolution drawn up by the UAE. I trust that all of our colleagues will summon the strength and courage to do this. Mr. President, 2 months of conflict in Gaza have wrought a horrific civilian suffering in the Strip. In this time, more than 10,000 Palestinian children have died. Information is becoming public about many destructions of hospitals, schools, refugee camps, and UN sites, together with humanitarian personnel. The magnitude of this devastation in and of itself reflects the indiscriminate use of force. Moreover, there are indicators of deliberate destruction of objects which are protected under international humanitarian law. War crimes are mounting. In recent days, there has been shocking information disseminated about Israeli plans to flood underground facilities in the Gaza Strip with seawater. According to publicly accessible information, Sahel has already established a system of pipes and pumps designed for pumping seawater, and presently is discussing with the United States the practical way to carry out this flooding, whether there is sufficient water, whether the topography of the tunnels will allow for this to be done, and so on. Such a step, if taken, will constitute a blatant war crime. Here we are not just talking about the fact that this flooding could be akin to an order for no mercy for anybody, and not even about the fact that there may be civilians present in these tunnels. The likelihood of this is very high. Where else can they flee from the indiscriminate bombardment as a whole, as well as the deliberate strikes targeting hospitals, schools, refugee camps, and UN sites? As you heard from the Secretary General today, safe spots in these small but densely populated strips simply don't exist. Its southern part, which had previously been enduring regular strikes, has now completely transformed into a zone of active military hostilities. The biased Western media outlets extol the genial tactical decisions of the Israeli army. They are not even trying to pose the question of what the consequences may be of pumping thousands of cubic meters of seawater, that is salt water, into the soil. And we see a clear plan to demolish the already tenuous agricultural capabilities of the strip insofar as seawater will inevitably pollute Gaza's groundwater. Here I wish to recall that from the very beginning of escalation, Israel has been obstructing the normal deliveries of drinking water to Gaza. The main part of the water supply has been disconnected. Deliveries are only being provided for the certain parts of the south of the strip. The humanitarian agencies unanimously say that this is not enough to provide for the basic needs of thousands of civilians besieged in Gaza. If on top of the artificially established problems with drinking water from the tap, if the groundwater is then also polluted, the situation will become catastrophic. Let us recall that pursuant to the norms of IHL, Article 23 and 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention dating 1949, the occupying power bears a specific responsibility to ensure that the civilian population has access to basic necessities. I wish to emphasize in particular that the consequences of the pollution of groundwater, the sole source of fresh water for the Gaza population, will persist not for years, but for a century. On top of incessant, indiscriminate bombardment and the targeted strikes targeting civilian objects, which are geared towards fomenting horror and panic among civilians, there is a systematic strategy taking shape for the violent displacement of Palestinians. Its cannibalistic logic is very simple: to make life in Gaza unendurable and even possibly to leave the population with a single choice: to leave their homes or to be killed. This is inhumane strategy which is abundant with war crimes. There are egregious violations of almost all provisions of Article 51 and 54 of the First Additional Protocol to the Geneva Conventions. These conventions, among other things, prohibit attacks against civilian populations and objects, acts or threats of violence, the main purpose of which is to spread terror against the civilian population, and prohibits resorting to indiscriminate attacks. We see the egregious war crimes being perpetrated, with weapons being used that are provided by Western countries, first and foremost the US and the UK, or with their full political support. I wish to stress that references by Israel and its allies to actions by Hamas on 7 October, which we of course condemn, do not justify, and in principle cannot justify, the large-scale systematic crimes and crimes against humanity which are being perpetrated in the Gaza Strip. Failure to respect humanitarian law by one party to the conflict in no way exempts the other party to the conflict from complying with the obligations incumbent upon them. Furthermore, Article 51 of the First Additional Protocol to the Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibits attacks against the civilian population or civilians by way of reprisals. Colleagues, at the same time, one can hardly trust that there will be due assessment of what is taking place by Western countries or such corrupt bodies under their control as the International Criminal Court. The ICC will never disobey its patrons or allies insofar as it is designed to advance their political agendas. For neither the US nor the United Kingdom nor other Western countries bore any responsibility whatsoever for their war crimes in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. We all remember how the British prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, disgracefully deprioritized, essentially simply stopped the investigation into the crimes of Western military personnel in these countries. We have no doubt that vis-a-vis Israel and its sponsors, it will do the same. Mr. President, of course we share the view that we all need to not lose sight of the prospects for Palestine-Israeli settlement on the basis of the two-state formula, which we believe has no alternative. We stand ready to work to that end. However, today the main priority is to end armed hostilities and to save Palestinians from extermination. To conclude, I wish to turn to our Arabic brethren and sisters in their native language.
أصدقاؤنا العرب الأعزاء.
My dear Arab friends, Russia calls to an end to the cycle of violence that began since the escalation between Israel and the Palestinians that we have been witnessing since the 7th of October. We add our voice to the calls to end for a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and return to addressing the root causes of this conflict and averting a humanitarian catastrophe from the Gaza Strip. We denounce categorically any act that may lead to civilian deaths, including women and children. We also do not accept any plot to forcibly displace the Gaza population to the south, which is a new Nakba for the Palestinian people. My country supports all constructive initiatives of the Security Council that aim to normalize the situation and open the space for a serious settlement process between the Palestinians and the Israelis against the background of the attempts by one of the Council members to slow or sabotage these collective efforts. In the face of these suspected plans, Russia continues to stand in solidarity with the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people to establish their independent state on the borders of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital and which coexists in peace and security with its neighbor Israel. Russia is preparing to multiply its efforts in order to achieve this desired objective based on the known agreed terms of reference, including the relevant Security Council resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative of 2003. And we are doing so in coordination with our partners. In this context, Russia supports the draft resolution tabled by the United Arab Emirates, and we call on all our colleagues in the Council to vote in favor of the resolution today. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank SG Guterres for his crucial briefing a moment ago. In his letter to the Council President on the 6th of December, the SG invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter and brought to the attention of the Security Council to the situation in Gaza, which may aggravate existing threats to international peace and security. The SG has just once again raised a sobering warning and made an appeal, fully demonstrating the gravity and urgency of the current situation. It once again demonstrates its sense of responsibility. The situation in front of and the task required of the Council is very clear and definitive. Act immediately, achieve a ceasefire, protect the civilians, and avoid a human catastrophe on a larger scale. The draft resolution tabled by the UAE on behalf of the Arab states reflects the universal call of the international community and represents the right direction for the restoration of peace. China fully supports this and would join in co-sponsoring this draft resolution. As it stands, Only a ceasefire can save lives and avoid a bigger human catastrophe. The war in Gaza has claimed the life of over 17,000 innocent civilians. Over 1 million people have fled from north to the south, only to find there's nowhere to hide and nowhere to go. This human catastrophe is too great for words to describe, that any waiting or delay means more death. At this juncture, only a ceasefire can avoid the havoc of regional conflagration. The negative effect of the conflict is spilling over in accelerated manner. The West Bank, the Lebanon-Israeli border, and the Syrian-Israeli border have frequently sounded the alarm. The crisis with a greater scope of impact is imminent. Any tolerance or connivance is pushing regional peace and security towards a precipice. At this juncture, only a ceasefire can create the necessary conditions for reviving the political prospects for the two-state solution. The two-state solution is the fundamental way toward the peaceful coexistence of two states, Palestine and Israel, and the lasting peace in the Middle East. Any action that allows the current conflict to drag on will only sow the seeds of hatred between the two sides and make the situation further deteriorate and do more damage to the political prospects of the two-state solution. At this moment, only a ceasefire is befitting the appropriate role of the Council. The international community eagerly look to the Council to assume its primary function in the maintenance of international peace and security. The Council has no other option but to act urgently without any procrastination to bring about a ceasefire and protect civilians. Any hesitation or excuse would be irresponsible. China strongly calls upon all members to adopt a responsible approach, support this Council to make the right decision in front of war and peace, life and death. Act for peace and act to save lives. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al
I thank the representative of China for your statement. I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Secretary General Gutierrez, for your briefing. For the past 2 months, this Council has been engaged in continuous meetings on the topics highlighted in your recent letter. In parallel, and even as we have supported the right of another member state to defend its people against heinous atrocities and acts of terrorism, the United States, at the highest levels, has undertaken intensive diplomacy to save lives and lay a foundation for a durable peace. American diplomacy opened the way for the first trucks that flowed into Gaza with aid. In partnership with Qatar and Egypt, it helped reunite more than 100 hostages with their loved ones and dramatically expanded aid to civilians in Gaza during a 7-day-long humanitarian pause. Hamas, however, has a different set of goals. Its refusal to release young women hostages led to a breakdown in the pause and resumption of the fighting. This Council's failure to condemn Hamas's October 7 terrorist attacks, including its acts of sexual violence and other unthinkable evils, is a serious moral failure. And it underscores the fundamental disconnect between the discussions that we have been having in this chamber and the realities on the ground. An undeniable part of that reality is that if Israel unilaterally laid down its weapons today, as some member states have called for, Hamas would continue to hold hostages, women and children, elderly men, many of whom, according to survivor accounts, are being subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment. And as of today, Hamas continues to pose a threat to Israel and remain in charge of Gaza. That is not a threat that any one of our governments would allow to continue to remain on our own borders. Not after the worst attack on our people in several decades. For that reason, while the United States strongly supports a durable peace in which both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security, we do not support calls for an immediate ceasefire. This would only plant the seeds for the next war, because Hamas has no desire to see a durable peace, to see a two-state solution. Colleagues, I am pained by the suffering that we have witnessed over the last 2 months. Even when we as governments are compelled to take up arms and protect our people from the most heinous acts of terrorism and violence, war is tragic. It is tragic for the families of the hostages who await word on the fate of their loved ones. We are doing everything possible to free the remaining hostages and reiterate our expectation that the ICRC be permitted to access and provide medical treatment to the hostages held by Hamas and other extremist groups. The war is equally tragic for civilians in Gaza. The scale of civilian suffering is devastating and heartbreaking. Hamas intentionally embeds itself within civilian areas. But that does not in any way change the fact that how Israel defends itself matters. We have been unequivocal. Israel must respect international humanitarian law and conduct its operations in a way that minimizes civilian harm. To back up these words and help protect civilians, we have supported establishing a more effective humanitarian deconfliction mechanism with the UN, and we are monitoring its implementation. This is a moral imperative and strategic imperative. You can only win in urban warfare by protecting civilians. In every conversation, we also have underscored that Israel must avoid further mass displacement of civilians in the south of Gaza, many of whom previously fled violence. Civilians must be provided adequate time and opportunity to move, including through corridors that allow people to move safely from defined areas of hostilities. Israel must further ensure sufficient humanitarian support exists for displaced individuals. Finally, civilians displaced in Gaza must have an opportunity to return home as soon as conditions permit. There must be no enduring internal displacement or reduction in Gaza's territory. Under no circumstances would the United States support the forced relocation of Palestinians from Gaza or the West Bank. Although the extended humanitarian pause has ended, again, by Hamas's choice, we have been clear that humanitarian aid must not only continue, it must be expanded. We welcome the Israeli government's decision to open Kerem Shalom for inspections and screening of humanitarian goods. We will continue to be in touch with Israel to ensure this happens, and on the timeline committed. We also welcome the Israeli government's decision to ensure the provision of fuel that meets requisite needs to sustain the humanitarian assistance operation, including vital civilian infrastructure. Both of these outcomes are a result of intensive U.S. engagement with all parties and are consistent with Resolution 2712. They lay the foundation to expand sustained, desperately needed humanitarian aid. Of course, humanitarian aid cannot be delivered if humanitarian workers are not protected, and all parties have an obligation to protect UN and humanitarian personnel. We offer our deepest condolences to all the families, friends, and colleagues of UNRWA staff who lost their lives since October 7. Attacks against UN shelters and facilities are unacceptable. We have also continued to press that work journalists do in conflict settings is vital, and they too must be protected. Israel must avoid damage to civilian infrastructure like hospitals, power stations, water facilities, and telecommunications infrastructure. Regarding the regional dimensions of this conflict, we are concerned by the renewed violence along the Blue Line. Restoring calm there is of utmost importance, as is fully implementing Security Council Resolution 1701. Moreover, we condemn the recent attacks by Houthis against 3 separate commercial vessels operating in international waters on the southern Red Sea. Consistent with Iran's long-term support and encouragement of the Houthis' destabilizing actions in the region, we know that Iran was engaged in planning Houthi operations. Iran has the choice to provide or withhold this support, without which the Houthis would struggle to effectively track and strike commercial vessels navigating shipping lanes through the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. We welcome the Council's press statement condemning these attacks and underlining the importance of navigational rights and freedoms of all vessels in the Red Sea. We are engaged in intensive consultations with partners and allies to determine the appropriate next steps. The United States has also been clear about the dangers from the rise in extremist violence committed by Israeli settlers against Palestinians in the West Bank. Violent extremist settlers must be held accountable for violent acts. And so, the United States is implementing a new visa restriction policy targeting individuals believed to have been involved in or meaningfully contributed to undermining peace, security, or stability in the West Bank. President Biden has been clear. The Palestinian people deserve a state of their own and a future free from Hamas. And a two-state solution is the only way to guarantee the long-term security of both the Israeli and the Palestinian people. Members of this Council advocating for resolutions have an obligation to explain how their proposals will break the cycle of unceasing violence and support the steps we all agree are necessary to lay the foundation for a more peaceful and secure future so that history does not keep repeating itself. Our goal should not simply be to stop the war for today. It should be to end the war forever, break the cycle of unceasing violence, and build something stronger in Gaza and across the Middle East so that history does not keep repeating itself. As has been the case since day one of this crisis, the United States will continue to use all its influence to encourage the reunification of hostages with their loved ones and the further expansion of aid to Palestinian civilians in Gaza who have suffered tremendous losses. We will continue pressing for the protection of civilians as Israel pursues legitimate military objectives. And we will not give up on a future where Hamas does not control Gaza, which is untenable for Israel's and the region's security and the well-being of the Palestinian people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, President. I would like to start by thanking the Secretary General for calling this meeting and for his remarks. Like others in this room, Albania shares the deep concerns on the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. We commend the efforts of the United Nations, regional partners, the United States, and all those who are working to guarantee the free flow of humanitarian aid in Gaza. We are also encouraged by the recent news on the possible use of the Kerem Shalom crossing for screening and inspections. It would increase and expedite the entry of more humanitarian assistance into Gaza, which is so much needed. Throughout this week, approximately 80 trucks per day made their way into Gaza, compared to over 200 during the November's week-long humanitarian pause. Civilians in Gaza need much more humanitarian aid than before the Hamas attack. President, while all efforts are concentrated in the protection of civilians and the provision of humanitarian aid to all those in need, we must not lose sight of the entire picture in this terrible situation. We reiterate our condemnation of the terrorist attack of Hamas on Israel and its people on the 7th of October, including the indiscriminate rocket launches on the residential areas of Israel. The horrible events of 7th of October, the abduction of innocent civilians, and the consecutive violence, including sexual violence and psychological pressure exercised on them, are unacceptable. Nothing justifies the abduction of civilians, and nothing can excuse their use for political goals. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages in compliance with international humanitarian law, and also condemn the use of Palestinian civilians as human shields by Hamas. The Security Council must stand up for such injustice towards the Palestinians, Israelis, and civilians of other nationalities, and hold Hamas accountable. We regret that the Security Council has not been able to condemn Hamas terror. By not condemning Hamas, the Security Council risks empowering them. This lack of condemnation does not contribute in in empowering the Palestinian Authority, doesn't help the Palestinian people, and does not contribute to the security of the entire region. Colleagues, the huge impact of the conflict between Israel and Hamas on the Palestinian civilians cannot be ignored. We call on Israel to fully comply with international humanitarian law and to exercise the principle of proportionality and distinction in its military operations. Protection of civilians at war is a must, and lives matter the same, Israelis and Palestinians alike. More should be done in protecting them and the civilian infrastructure. Furthermore, we call on Israel to address the issue of the increased settlers' violence on Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. We deplore the extremist violence and call for those responsible to be held accountable. In conclusion, President, while all efforts are invested towards restoring the calm on the ground, the international community must also seek to restore the perspective of a political horizon based on securing Israel's right to exist and its security on one hand, and a viable pathway for Palestinians to have their own state and freedom on the other hand. It's time to think seriously and start setting the foundation of a future in security, dignity, and prosperity for all. Thank you, President.
Agradezco la representante de...
I thank the representative of Albania for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
I also thank the Secretary General for his sobering briefing and emphasize Malta's full support for his decision to invoke Article 99 of the Charter. The catastrophic situation and hostilities in Gaza are fueling unprecedented levels of human suffering and threaten regional peace with serious international repercussions. Over 15,000 people have been killed so far, 67% of whom are women and children. Apart from the implementation of all provisions of Resolution 2712, which includes the unconditional release of all remaining hostages, an immediate humanitarian ceasefire is now critical. We are disappointed that the temporary truce that was achieved a few weeks ago, allowing for the release of hostages and much-needed aid into Gaza, has broken down. The resumption of hostilities in the Gaza Strip is disconcerting. This renewed fighting has brought with it more deaths and devastation, and added to the extreme hardships of a population under siege. President, in the past weeks, several UN agencies and humanitarian partners have outlined the unfolding catastrophe. This Council must heed their warnings. Inaction is not an option. Civilians in Gaza are lacking the basic means for survival. These include food, water, and medicine. The healthcare system is on its knees. Collapsing hospitals and a handful of UNRWA facilities are sheltering over 1 million people. 133 UNRWA workers have been killed. The agency's ability to work is at stake. These conditions are compounding serious risks of widespread disease. Children are yet again bearing the brunt of the hostilities. They continue to be killed, maimed, and denied access to healthcare and education. Thousands have been orphaned. This must stop. The future of an entire generation is being jeopardized. There is no scenario which justifies the denial of aid for 2.2 million people, 80% of whom have been displaced. In conformity with international law, all parties are obliged to ensure that civilians and civil infrastructure are protected. The scaling up and distribution of humanitarian aid, together with the safety of UN and humanitarian workers, must be guaranteed. The only way to achieve these imperatives is through a humanitarian ceasefire. On several occasions, Malta has unreservedly condemned Hamas's acts of terror, including the heinous attacks of 7th October, the attack in Jerusalem on 30th November, and the indiscriminate rocket fire. Hamas's strategy of embedding itself among civilian infrastructure in Gaza and reports of sexual violence committed are reprehensible. Terror has no justification, and this Council must also be clear in rejecting it. Malta recognizes Israel's right to protect her people, but all actions must be in line with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and necessity. President, the situation in the West Bank has seen unprecedented escalations in the past 8 weeks. We are deeply worried at reports of increasingly heavy incursions, restrictions, and mass detainment occurring throughout the West Bank, including in refugee camps. A resurgence of illegal settler encroachment and violence is also gravely concerning. Settlements are illegal under international law and constitute an obstacle to peace. We condemn the forcible transfer of the Palestinian community in Zanuta and the recent destruction of its EU-funded school by Israeli settlers. Furthermore, we are alarmed at the precarious skirmishes on the Israeli-Lebanese border. Malta condemns all violations on the Blue Line, including attacks against UNIFIL. We strongly call for all parties, including non-state actors in the region, to exercise restraint, de-escalate, and respect the norms of international law. Further conflict fronts must be avoided at all costs. Vitally, a comprehensive resolution of the spiraling crisis must include a serious recommitment towards peace. This is only achievable through dialogue and a political horizon which aims to holistically address both Israel's security concerns and the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians, including their right to self-determination. Malta reaffirms its unwavering commitment to a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security, in line with relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. We remain convinced that this is the only path to a lasting and sustainable peace in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France. Mr. President, I welcome the Secretary General to the Council this morning, and I would reiterate to him the full support of France for his efforts. It is up to us to collectively uphold international peace and security. The Secretary General has clearly stated it. The humanitarian situation on the Gaza Strip is disastrous. A week after the expiration of the truce, Gaza has been targeted with bombardment, with growing risks of epidemic, famine, lack of access to medical care, and the consequence of displacement on an increasingly narrower piece of land. In the face of this severe crisis, Council must act. France reiterates its appeal for a new, immediate, and lasting humanitarian truce that should lead to a permanent ceasefire. This requires the delivery of more humanitarian aid. Humanitarian actors are no longer capable of carrying out their operations. A protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure and healthcare infrastructure and humanitarian personnel must be guaranteed. Access to water, to fuel, to medication, food, and basic necessities must be ensured. The opening of new crossing points is necessary, including the Kerem Shalom passing point, as well as an increase in the volume passing through Rafah, and procedures for inspecting aid should not delay the delivery of aid. To act is also to continue our collective mobilization. That was the goal of the follow-up meeting on the 9th of November, chaired by the Minister Catherine Cotola. Of the meeting that it was held on the 6th December. The 9th November meeting allowed the raising of over $1 billion. France has already announced an additional $100 million for 2023, including $54 million for UNRWA, as well as a cargo sent of 600 tons in addition to the 200 tons already delivered. It has also cared for civilians on the helicopter carrier Dixmude. It's also time to put an end to Hamas and other terrorist groups who have committed the worst atrocities on the 7th of October, including sexual violence. It is unacceptable that this Council has not yet been able to condemn these acts. Israel can count on the support of France to fight against Hamas. We have adopted measures against the commanders of Hamas with a view to extending them to the European level. Hamas must release all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Mr. President, the situation in the West Bank is also very concerning. France condemns the recent decisions on settlement expansion and the violence carried out by groups of settlers. Israeli authorities must put an end to this and persecute their perpetrators. France intends to impose a bar on entry to France and an asset freeze against these people. France is mobilizing to avoid a regional conflagration and calls on all parties for restraint. The continuing clashes along the Lebanese border between Lebanon and Israel is of grave concern, and we call on all parties involved to fully implement Resolution 1701. Mr. President, what's most important is to restore a political horizon on the basis of the only viable solution, the two-state solution, two states living side by side in peace and security. It's not enough to invoke these prospects. We need to make this a reality without further ado, make them a reality. To delay once again is to ensure that the next crisis will be even worse than the tragedy we're experiencing now. France is ready to take active part in these efforts. The President of France and the Minister are fully mobilized to this end and continue their discussions with their colleagues in the region. Thank you. I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for having convened today's briefing in response to the call from the Secretary General, whose presence at the Security Council today Switzerland welcomes. The invocation for the first time under his mandate of Article 99 of the United Nations Charter bears witness to the dramatic situation prevailing in the Middle East today. I wish to take this opportunity to reiterate our sincerest condolences to the 130 United Nations personnel who have lost their lives. Switzerland shares the Secretary General's concern that the situation could have irreversible consequences for peace and security of the entire region and even beyond. Therefore, it is imperative for the Security Council to be seized of the matter and to act to prevent an even more serious deterioration. On several occasions, Switzerland has strongly condemned the acts of terror, indiscriminate attacks, and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas. Since 7 October, they have claimed more than 1,200 victims in Israel, including many women and young girls who have been exposed to sexual and gender-based violence. Never before in this region have Palestinian civilians paid such a heavy price in such a short space of time. In 2 months, more than 17,000 Palestinians, 70,000 of whom are women and children, were killed in the bombardments in Gaza. Switzerland deplores the deaths of thousands of civilians in Israel and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, and we express our deepest condolences to the families of all of the victims. Switzerland has made respect for IHL and the protection of civilians in particular a priority for our mandate on the Security Council. Along with the Secretary General, we have arrived at the bitter conclusion that there is, and I quote, no effective protection for civilians, and that, I quote, no one is safe, unquote, in Gaza today, not even humanitarian workers, the medical staff, and the wounded. Not even journalists are safe. There were more than 63 journalists killed, according to the Media Freedom Coalition, since 7 October. Not even the 138 hostages are safe, whose immediate and unconditional release we call for. We reiterate that investigations need to be carried out into all violations of international law committed in Israel and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory to ensure that the perpetrators are brought to justice. The destruction and damage to civilian infrastructure, including more than 60% of housing units, the collapse of the medical system, the saturation of schools and other UNRWA structures which have become places of refuge for more than 1 million people, all of this plunges the Gaza Strip into total insecurity. We call for respect for IHL and human rights, while recognizing Israel's right to ensure its security. We also remind the belligerents of their obligations in the conduct of hostilities, particularly that of respecting the principles of proportionality, distinction, and precaution in all circumstances. Respect IHL and human rights is a necessity in order to prevent a regional escalation of the conflict, of which we are seeing worrying signs both in the West Bank and in Lebanon. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, the humanitarian tradition to which my country is closely linked was born in the midst of a battlefield of ruins. This tradition advocates the obligations to come to the aid of civilians in need. It is for this reason that Switzerland supports the draft resolution submitted by the Emirati delegation, which is due to be put to the vote this afternoon. Resolution 2712 of this Council conveys the same duty of humanity. It reiterates the need for full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to civilians. The observation that the implementation of this resolution is untenable in the current circumstances means that this minimum of humanity is not currently guaranteed in Gaza. Humanitarian aid is an obligation. It is not an end in itself. It will save lives and inject some dignity into a conflict that imperatively needs a political solution in the terms repeatedly emphasized by this Council and in accordance with international law. Thank you.
Agradezco a la representante. I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement, and I now give the floor to Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we thank Ecuador presidency for convening this emergency meeting. Our appreciation is extended to the UN Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, for calling the Security Council's attention to the escalating danger and the catastrophic implication of the Gaza situation poses to global peace and security in accordance with Article 99 of the UN Charter. Mr. President, since the resumption of hostilities on the 1st December 2023, following a week of humanitarian pause, the reports in Gaza, including the southern region, bearing the brunt of the Israel military operations, are of an increasingly worse scenario. The situation is quickly getting out of control, posing potential long-term effects on the security and stability of the region, as well as the Palestinian people in general. There is a possibility of a collapse in the humanitarian system, as highlighted by the Secretary General, and underscores the need to collective action to avert this imminent humanitarian disaster. It is in this vein Mozambique echoes the UN Secretary General's appeal for an immediate ceasefire to prevent a humanitarian crisis. To alleviate the continued suffering of innocent civilians in Gaza, a permanent humanitarian ceasefire between the parties is required. The repeated warnings from UN agencies, humanitarian organizations, and other players of an impending monumental humanitarian crisis in Gaza should prompt us to take immediate action. Mr. President, given the scale of loss of life in Gaza, Mozambique calls upon this Council and the international community to fully leverage their influence for the cessation of hostilities in Gaza, ensuring humanitarian assistance and restoring dialogue between the parties. We urge the Israeli authorities to implement the Security Council Resolution 2712 of November 15, 2023, to enable the delivery of life-saving supplies and services that are vital to the survival and well-being of defenseless civilians, particularly children. Practical steps must be taken now to ensure the implementation of this resolution, including an effective mechanism. Mr. President, we reiterate our call to the parties to comply with their obligations regarding to protect of civilians in accordance with the international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We urgently call the parties to demonstrate leadership and courage by engaging in dialogue to achieve a long-lasting solution, allowing both Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security as good neighbors in accordance with the United Nations Charter. Finally, To realize this noble goal, we appeal the members of the Security Council to exert their influence on the concerned parties. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Mozambique.
I thank Mozambique for your statement, and I give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you to the Secretary-General for your briefing and for your letter to the Security Council under Article 99. Colleagues, these are dark days. The horror of Hamas' 7 October attacks hangs over us, including the shocking reports of sexual violence by Hamas against Israeli women and girls, and the terrible and heart-wrenching suffering of innocent Palestinians, including many women and young children, is a humanitarian tragedy unfolding before our eyes. The Secretary-General, who has our strong support, set out clearly the trajectory towards humanitarian catastrophe facing Palestinians in Gaza. We need to respond, and to respond with urgency. The sheer scale of civilians killed is shocking, and the fact that 80% of the population has been displaced in Gaza cannot continue. The UK continues to support Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas terrorism as it seeks the return of over 100 hostages who are still held in Gaza. But we are absolutely clear that Israel must be targeted and precise in achieving that goal. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary of the UK have delivered this message and will continue to do so. Civilians must be protected. In parallel, we need a marked increase in the provision of sustainable and unhindered delivery of life-saving aid and essential services to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe from taking place. This includes increasing the types of aid allowed. The sanitation and shelter picture, together with the lack of medical provision in Gaza, is dire, and there's a desperate need for sanitation and shelter kits and vital medicines. It is welcome that Kerem Shalom will now be opened for screening aid deliveries. We urge Israel to go further and to fully open Kerem Shalom to allow goods to cross so that the huge volumes of aid that are needed can reach the people of Gaza. This should include, at minimum, the 200,000 litres of fuel per day for which the UN has called. It is imperative that we work to agree further urgently needed humanitarian pauses, building on the pivotal work of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. President, as we work to halt the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, we need also to work to avoid escalation in the West Bank, including in occupied East Jerusalem. Israel's announcement approving further settlements in the lower aqueduct area of East Jerusalem is alarming and serves only to raise the tensions in the West Bank when international effort is focusing on avoiding further conflict. Let me be clear. Settlements are illegal under international law. They present an obstacle to peace, and they threaten the physical viability and delivery of a two-state solution. This decision must be reversed with immediate effect. President, let us work together to deliver peace, dignity, and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for your statement. I now give the floor to Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the Secretary General for his commitment and his efforts to ensure that the letter and the spirit of the United Nations Charter prevail in the war between Israel and Hamas. The scale of violence, the deadly scale of violence here and the devastation have reached staggering, inhumane proportions. We extend our deep support and appreciation for the significant measure of responsibility of the Secretary General in invoking Article 99 of the Charter of the United Nations. The United Nations Security Council has a duty to respond without further delay to the formal, unprecedented call of the Secretary General in light of the magnitude of the unbearable humanitarian disaster that is taking place before our eyes in the siege of Gaza. There is a vital, fundamental need to achieve an immediate ceasefire to end the tragedy in Gaza. In light of the magnitude of the situation and the gravity of the threats to international and regional peace and security and the risks of conflagration, we need to rekindle the hope that was generated in the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 2712, dating 15 November 2023. Distinguished colleagues, no calculation is acceptable when it comes to saving human lives. Gabon firmly condemns all attacks which target civilian populations. We call upon all parties to exercise restraint. We call on all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. It is more urgent than ever before to establish a humanitarian ceasefire. The Security Council has a duty to unstintingly persevere in efforts to that end in order to save human lives, particularly the lives of children, of women, and of civilian populations in Gaza and in the region. Likewise, we need to insist that humanitarian assistance be delivered without obstacles and in sufficient quantities in a manner that respects humanitarian law. We wish to reiterate the fact that there is an overriding need for all hostages to be freed. We reiterate that the civilian population, that civilians being used as human shields is not acceptable. We reiterate the humanitarian, collective punishment targeting civilian populations is unacceptable. We reiterate that the right to legitimate defense of Israel needs to include respect for the principle of proportionality, of distinction, and precaution. The Security Council has a duty to adopt a firmer commitment to ensure accountability for grave violations of international law. Since the barbaric attacks perpetrated by Hamas on 7 October, my country firmly condemned those attacks. For Gabon, the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict hinges on the resumption of dialogue and the peace process to reach a two-state solution, a solution of two states coexisting peacefully on the basis of internationally recognized borders. A two-state solution needs to be made a reality without further delay. To achieve this, dialogue and negotiation are key, with the central role of the United Nations. Thank you.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Gabon for your statement. I now give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank you, Secretary General Guterres, for your briefing. Mr. President, it has been more than 2 months since Hamas's brutal terror attack on October 7th, where more than 1,200 people were killed in Israel and around 250 taken hostage, and more than half of whom are still held captive. We once again unequivocally condemn the terror attacks by Hamas and other militants and demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Since that attack, Gaza has descended into one of the most devastating humanitarian crises in the world. More than 17,000 Palestinians have been reportedly killed. The majority of them are women and children, and thousands more are under the rubble of destroyed buildings. This is an appalling loss of life. Now, winter is approaching in Gaza, and the streets and unruly UNRWA facilities are packed with the newly displaced, many of whom are fleeing from a second time. Most basic goods are not available. To echo the words of the Secretary General, the nightmare in Gaza is a crisis of humanity. Mr. President, Japan takes seriously the Secretary General's invocation of Article 99 of the UN Charter, urging the members of the Security Council to avert a humanitarian catastrophe and to appeal for humanitarian ceasefire to be declared, given the grave human loss in such a short period of time. We deeply regret that no significant humanitarian aid has been delivered since the breakdown of the humanitarian pause last week. The delivery of essential supplies solely through the Rafah crossing is utterly insufficient. Of course, we welcome that Israel agreed to open Karem Shalom crossing for screening and inspection. The establishment of monitoring mechanism under the authority of the UN is also critical. Japan believes the Council cannot simply watch the situation deteriorating. It is our responsibility to address this grave humanitarian situation immediately. What is more, there are increasingly serious spillovers concerns in the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and the Red Sea. This situation could all too easily engulf the already volatile region. Against this backdrop, Japan's position is clear. Humanitarian concerns should be given utmost priority. All parties must abide by UN Security Council Resolution 2712. And more than that, the Council must urgently speak in a united voice, whatever the language we may agree upon, to avert a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. The bottom line is that hostilities must stop immediately for a period that allows for meaningful humanitarian operations to avert a humanitarian catastrophe. Mr. President, only a two-state solution will enable both Israelis and Palestinians to live in lasting and secure peace. Today, that goal seems far off. Gaza has been devastated. The task of reconstruction will be enormous, and we must consider what political and security arrangement will be in place when the fighting stops. But even amidst the current disparate crisis, we must not forget that peace and coexistence is possible. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Japón.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement. I now give the floor to Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking you for convening this meeting. I also thank the Secretary General for his briefing and his intervention and efforts in helping to find a solution to the ongoing war between the State of Israel and Hamas. Mr. President, the resumption of hostilities, which followed the end of the temporary humanitarian pause that was brokered by the State of Qatar and the United States, has been of great concern to Ghana. We are equally worried about the challenge of committing to the spirit of the humanitarian pauses and the obligation to preserve civilian lives and infrastructure, which makes a humanitarian ceasefire more necessary now, as called for by the Secretary General. It is in that regard that we welcome the decision by the Secretary General to invoke Article 99 of the UN Charter, which has only been invoked 4 times in the over 7 decades of history of the United Nations, the last time being in 1989. We note that the ongoing Israeli-Hamas conflict has unfortunately taken a heavy toll on the civilian population on both sides and consequently created a serious security and humanitarian crisis, not only in Gaza, but also in Israel and the other occupied Palestinian territories. It is regrettable that civilians and non-combatants, especially those residing in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Israeli communities along the border with Gaza, are bearing the brunt of the violence. We are concerned that the already dire humanitarian situation in Gaza has rapidly worsened in the last few days. Unfortunately, the use of heavy weaponry and the bombardment of Gaza has made it extremely difficult for humanitarian actors to have access to many of the internally displaced people, including the aged, pregnant women, and children who face significant challenges, including limited access to essential services such as healthcare, clean water, and electricity. Ghana, like all the other delegations, is worried about the decision by the Israeli government to expand its ground operations to cover all parts of the Gaza Strip. The decision puts the lives of the civilian population in the densely populated Gaza Strip at serious risk. We note that the destruction of critical infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, exacerbates the suffering of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. We join in the appeal by the Secretary General and all Council members for both Israeli security forces and Hamas to prioritize and put in adequate measures to protect civilians on both sides, as per the principles of international humanitarian law governing the legal use of force in an armed conflict. The ongoing war presents complex security and humanitarian concerns that require immediate attention by this Council. The security concerns of both Israel and the Palestinian people must be addressed. International cooperation, direct diplomatic negotiations, and a commitment by both Israel and Palestinian Authority to engage in frank dialogue are essential to address the underlying causes of the conflict and for achieving lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. The security of Israel and the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people for their homeland lies in a deepened commitment to a negotiated two-state solution on the basis of the pre-1967 borders with Jerusalem as the shared capital. We call on Council members with moderating influence on both Israel and Hamas to use all means possible to heed the calls of the international community for steps leading to peace and an eventual settlement of the conflict. In closing, we wish to reiterate our long-held belief that it is only through a comprehensive and inclusive approach that the Middle East question can be settled. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
I thank the Presidency for convening this open briefing upon the timely request of the United Arab Emirates and the Russian Federation. I thank the Secretary General for his important briefing. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is appalling and without precedent. Secretary General Guterres, for the first time since the beginning of his tenure, invoked Article 99 of the Charter to address this Council. And it is not that the world has been spared from serious conflicts elsewhere since then. We commend the Secretary General's initiative, which convenes another express call for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. Appeals for a humanitarian ceasefire from the international community, the United Nations, humanitarian actors, and also by all members of this Council have justifiably multiplied over the past weeks after more than 2 months of conflict. An urgent ceasefire is even more needed now since the resumption of hostilities. The conflict has brought the humanitarian system in support of civilian lives in Gaza to the point of total and unprecedented collapse. Over 80% of Palestinians in Gaza were uprooted from their homes and are becoming ever more deprived of the minimum necessary to survive. These conditions are unacceptable. We recall Brazil's efforts in this Council since the very beginning of the crisis, including during its presidency. Our draft resolution was supported by the vast majority of Council members, but was vetoed by a permanent member, as was the case with other drafts. Our proposal called for immediate humanitarian pauses, among other provisions. If adopted on that occasion, thousands of lives would have been saved. Brazil also spared no efforts in joining the international initiatives in support of a humanitarian ceasefire and to ensuring the protection of civilians. We are being constantly reminded that there is no safe place in Gaza. The repetition of this extremely worrying statement, compounded by the increasing and devastating human toll prompted by the conflict, constitutes another wake-up call to this Council. We must step up and act responsibly to respond to this unfolding tragedy. The dramatic humanitarian situation leaves us with no alternative. We need an immediate halt in hostilities for as long as necessary, allowing for proper humanitarian action. The provisions of Resolution 2712, recently adopted by this very Council, must be fully implemented. In the absence of this, we, particularly those responsible for any failure, risk complicity and a very negative judgment by history. It is difficult to express the frustration that many of us continue to feel. That frustration is not just with Council inaction. We urge all those with power to influence the key stakeholders to allow for the necessary conditions for a meaningful action by the Council. Mr. President, once again, it is necessary to reiterate that obligations under international law, and especially international humanitarian law, must be respected in any conflict. We recall the need to act according to the principles of distinction, proportionality, necessity, and humanity. The protection of the civilian population and civilian infrastructure is an obligation under international humanitarian law, as is the prohibition of forcibly displacing civilians or the taking of hostages. We reiterate the call to allow access to hostages to the International Red Cross. All this, unfortunately, applies to the current hostilities in Gaza. There can be no politically and morally justifiable attitude towards the growing tragedy in Gaza, other than working to protect civilian lives now and keep up the pressure for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held captive. We members of this Council have more than a moral imperative now. We need to do what is in our reach to stop this humanitarian catastrophe. Failing this task would likely result in a scenario where the authority and legitimacy of the Council would erode even further and prove its incapacity to discharge its duties according to the United Nations Charter, to the detriment of world peace and security, as we can see in these days. As a consequence of all said, we will vote in favor of the draft resolution tabled by the UAE for a vote this afternoon, and we co-sponsor it. Thank you.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Brazil for a statement, and I will now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Ecuador. To start, I would like to thank the Secretary General for his intervention this morning and reiterate the support of Ecuador for his work and for the work of the entire UN system in these difficult times. Last Wednesday, for the first time in over 30 years, Article 99 of the Charter was invoked that allows the Secretary General to draw attention of this Council to any issue which, in his judgment, can threaten the maintenance of international peace and security. He did that in the face of the scale of the loss of human lives in Gaza and Israel in the 2 months that have passed since the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. He did it because the situation is deteriorating rapidly and to avoid it leading to a total collapse, a disaster with consequences that could be irreversible for peace and security in the region. Your Excellencies, colleagues, Ecuador has clearly condemned in unequivocal way the unjustifiable and horrific terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas, as well as to demand that all hostages be liberated immediately and unconditionally. We have done this on many opportunities in various forums, and we would like to do it today once again. Also, we'd like to clearly recall that the Palestinian people have an inalienable right to free determination and to legitimate aspirations of living in security, freedom, justice, with opportunities and dignity. We have expressed our solidarity with Israel and with Palestine because every life is valuable, because every death hurts us, pains us, because there is no justification at all for causing pain and death to innocent civilians. We have stated that Israel has the right to defend its population and also the overriding obligation to uphold the principles of international law and international humanitarian law as it exercises its right to self-defense. We have also rejected the use of civilians as human shields by Hamas. Ultimately, our position has been clear and has been based on international law and on the principle of defending human life and dignity. These are the principles that are guiding us on this topic and on every topic without any double standards. Colleagues, Excellencies, consistent with these principles and heeding the appeal of the Secretary General, we believe that it is essential to have a humanitarian ceasefire to alleviate the terrible situation in Gaza and diminish the risk of an extension of the violence to the region. Unfortunately, no action of this Council can return the lives lost, but we can try to avoid more suffering, more pain, and more death. Each day, every minute, every second counts, because every single life counts. I now go back to my role as President of the Council. And I would like to give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and congratulations on assuming the presidency of the Security Council. And
Shukran. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council. I represent the Arab group today, and I summon the history, and I remind everyone that the United Nations, where we are speaking today, was born out of grave human suffering during the Second World War. It was established to prevent repetition of the suffering. The founders of the UN Charter have placed before their eyes the noble purpose of this organization, and the most important duty of this council, the Security Council, is as stipulated by the Charter, and I quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and for these ends, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security." End of quote. Mr. President, the Muslim and Arab worlds, and all peace-loving nations, and justice-loving nations, and every individual with a living conscience is looking towards the role of this organization and this council, in particular during this humanitarian catastrophe that is unprecedented, that has inflicted the unarmed Palestinian people. They are looking with rage and accusation, yes, accusation and criticism, because of the lack of justice and equality after the Council for 2 months has been unable to fulfill its responsibility to reach a ceasefire. And in fact, there is who obstructs the ceasefire in a precedent that will impact, if it has not impacted already, the credibility of the United Nations in addressing present and future crises. Mr. President, today is the beginning of the 3rd month of the war on Gaza, which has led until now to the death of more 17,000 Palestinian deaths who are innocent from these unarmed citizens, 70% of which who are women and children. This is a statistic that lays bare the lie of the claim that this is a war against an armed group. It is a war of collective punishment and of genocide, unfortunately, of the Palestinian people. The war has led to the destruction of more than 60% of the establishments and buildings in the Gaza Strip, and it has destroyed and damaged more than 339 education facilities, 26 hospitals, 56 health facilities, 20 water and sanitation facilities, 121 government offices, 56 ambulances, 100 mosques, in addition to targeting the United Nations itself, who was not spared the killing after more than 130 UN staff members have been killed. I would like now here, and on behalf of all the Arabs, to applaud the integrity and bravery of UN staff members, whether in the occupied Palestinian territory or at the headquarters, led by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. I applaud them for fulfilling their duties and their efforts, their honest efforts to assist the Palestinian people. And I applaud their bravery and sincerity in defending the values of this organization, despite the criminal targeting against them and the difficulties imposed by Israel, the occupying power, over their work. And despite the campaign they're suffering of defamation and terrorism, the Arab group supports you with all its might and applauds your integrity. Antonio Guterres, Lazzarini, Lane Hastings, Sema Bahouth, Martin Griffiths, Tor Winsland. We will stand in solidarity with you so long as you continue to fulfill your duties and continue to protect the values of the United Nations. Mr. President, the Arab group would like to place on record before everyone that the Israeli aggression has led to the displacement of more than 1.5 million Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip. 85% of the inhabitants were forcibly displaced and forced to live in dire circumstances in the UNRWA facilities and in hospitals and elsewhere, circumstances that represent the worst of crime, wars, and crimes against humanity that clearly aim to, unfortunately, to eliminate the Palestinian people and end their cause. Mr. President, in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem as well, the settler crimes are escalating under the protection of the Israeli army. We are now before a systemic killing of the Palestinian people. In the West Bank and in East Jerusalem since October, more than 250 have been killed, martyred, in addition to many displaced persons because of the settlement expansions and the dispossession of homes and the destruction of establishments and criminal attacks by the settlers. The Arab group places on record that this aggression and this occupation also attacks Syria and Lebanon, through which they are targeting the safe villages in the south of Lebanon and the Lebanese army and the journalists who report on the facts in great danger in a way that may lead the entire region to a wider conflict. Mr. President, the Arab group calls on the Security Council to uphold its duties in the maintenance of international peace and security and demands in this context to demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire as per the Arab draft resolution tabled in order to end the bloodshed. This is an opportunity for the Council to save what it can after more than 60 days of the war. We also call on the Council to address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. The United Arab Emirates, the Arab member of the Council, has tabled a draft resolution, another humanitarian draft resolution, in order to increase the assistance to the unarmed Palestinians through all crossings. Mr. President, the Arab group stresses once again that demanding a ceasefire and opening the crossings and allowing the flow of humanitarian assistance is not an act of pity or sympathy, but it is a right of civilians enshrined in international instruments and the agreed principles of humanitarian rights. It is also a political obligation and legal and moral obligation. on all of us. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, the Arabs were the ones who initiated peace with Israel and for long decades have expressed their commitment to a political solution, despite the rejection of Israel to engage with the calls for peace, and despite the repeated crimes of Israel against civilians, and despite the ideological extremism that is on the rise in Israel. The Arabs continue to commit to peace because they understand well, as people of a civilization, that violence will not lead to peace and genocide will not succeed in ending the cause of a nation, and that dialogue and peaceful coexistence are the only way for stability to be achieved in the region. This is what leads us, after ending this destructive war, to commit to resuming the political process as soon as possible in order to achieve a just and lasting comprehensive peace in the Middle East through the establishment of a Palestinian state on the borders of June 4th, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Egypt, and I now give the floor to the representative of Qatar. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm making this statement on behalf of the member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Sultanate of Oman, the State of Kuwait, and the State of Qatar. We are grateful to you for convening this meeting, and we would like to thank the Secretary General for his participation, which is very important in light of developments in the Gaza Strip. The member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council condemn the Israeli aggression. We consider that Israel is legally responsible for its continued aggression, in particular against innocent civilians, thousands of whom have perished, mainly women and children, in flagrant violation of humanitarian law, and international law and international humanitarian law. And we refuse any justification to consider the Israeli aggression as an act of self-defense. The international community must take necessary steps in the framework of international law to react to the Israeli practices and the measures of collective punishment against the inhabitants of Gaza. We invite the international community to provide the protection to our brethren Palestinian people. We reject measures leading to the forced displacement of the inhabitants of Gaza. We condemn that the occupation forces are targeting civilian infrastructures, including schools, hospitals, and refugee shelters. Also, the occupation forces are killing journalists and are targeting international facilities, as well as the headquarters of the Qatari Committee for the Reconstruction of Gaza. The Israeli blockade contravenes international humanitarian law and Resolution 2417, which, in fact, their actions are meant to prevent the delivery of humanitarian assistance and is a policy to starve the Palestinian people. We welcome the mediation of the United States, Egypt, and others and Qatar in achieving a humanitarian truce, which led to the exchange of hostages and the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We regret the end of the truce and the increase in Israeli attacks, which has led to the displacement of millions and prevents the work of numerous humanitarian and UN organizations. We welcome Resolution 2712, which calls for humanitarian truce and immediate humanitarian truces and lasting ones and throughout Gaza. We call on its immediate implementation, full implementation, with a mechanism to monitor its implementation. We also welcome the measures taken by the Secretary General and his invoking Article 99 of the Charter to demand the Council to announce an immediate ceasefire. The Security Council, pursuant to the Charter, must demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and to demand the sides to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and international law. We demand, on behalf of the Arab group, the immediate end of hostilities and a ceasefire, delivery of humanitarian assistance and basic necessities to all the inhabitants of Gaza, and to make sure that the delivery of assistance is done immediately, as well as the provision of water, electricity, fuel, and food. The Gulf Cooperation Council is providing emergency relief and assistance to our brothers and sisters in Gaza, in addition to financial support to the United Nations and in particular to UNRWA, in light of the growing needs as well as the Israeli attacks against UNRWA facilities and UNRWA staff. We call on the international community to increase humanitarian assistance immediately in favor of UNRWA and the United Nations. The member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council reiterate their unchanged position with regard to the centrality of the Palestinian question and the need to put an end to Israeli occupation, and in support of Palestinian sovereignty over all occupied territories and the creation of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as capital. And also we support the rights of refugees in line with the initiative of the Arab states to realize the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. We support the initiative of Saudi Arabia and the League of Arab States in cooperation with the Egypt and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to relaunch the peace process. And we call on the Security Council to adopt a resolution in order to recognize an independent Palestinian state, which should become a fully fledged member of the United Nations. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the Palestinian people in this tragedy, and we must be intransigent and act until we achieve their full rights. Thank you very much.
Agradezco a la representante.
I thank the representative of Qatar, and I now give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am speaking on behalf of Bangladesh, Malaysia, Maldives, Namibia, Timor-Leste, Turkey, and my own country, Indonesia. Mr. President, in one autumn season, the world stood by and watched over 16,000 people killed in Gaza, whole families and generations wiped out, including more than 6,000 children. The latest words to describe the situation faced by innocent women and children in Gaza is apocalyptic conditions. Saying this has taken a toll in our collective conscience is an understatement. If we fail to act, history will judge us as accomplices to crimes against humanity. When the world vowed never again over 75 years ago, it was not meant only for certain race, nor for certain religious group. It was to protect everyone in this world. It was to save humanity. Mr. President, we fully support the Secretary General's recent letter to the member of this Council calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. In this very Council, on the 24th of October open debate, we underline that an immediate ceasefire is vital to end atrocities and the deteriorating humanitarian situation. This is the least that the Council should do, if we truly want to uphold human rights and humanity. And this is why we are proud to co-sponsor the draft resolution on humanitarian ceasefire. We call on the Council to adopt this declaration today. In this regard, allow me to state 3 points. First, please show compassion to humanity. Focus on the innocent civilian, women, children, the infirm. How many more lives, how many more children must we sacrifice? How many more must die before the relentless assault is halted? 20,000, 50,000, 100,000? Listen to the collective plea of the global community. Stop the attack on women and children in Gaza. Let adequate humanitarian assistance into all parts of Gaza. Second, the threat of spillover of the conflict may not just be regional, but global. The situation in Gaza is being broadcast 24/7, uncensored, through social media and electronic channels. The world watches in horror as women and children become innocent casualties in this devastating conflict. We cannot afford to let radical elements take up arms in different parts of the world, or even radicalize the moderates. Lastly, let us reaffirm our commitment to uphold international law and international humanitarian law in its entirety. There must be no double standard in upholding international law and international humanitarian law, in upholding accountability. It should be applied equally to all countries, no matter big or small. There must be no double standards on humanity. For these reasons, we appeal to members of the Council, do the right thing. Stop these inhumane acts against the Palestinians. Listen to your conscience. Let us choose peace over conflict, compassion over cruelty, and unity over division. Let us work to bring peace to Palestine and Israel. Let us address the root cause and make the two-state solution a reality. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Indonesia por...
I thank the representative of Indonesia for his statement, and I now give the floor to Madam Hedda Sampson, in charge of the EU delegation of the United Nations.
The EU supports the UN Secretary-General's call for the UN Security Council to act to avert the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and the collapse of the humanitarian system. Urgent action is needed to ensure the protection of all civilians. The EU deplores the high number of civilian casualties killed, the majority of which are women and children. We commend the strong efforts of the UN and all humanitarian actors to deliver life-saving aid in extremely dire conditions. We deplore the death of a record number of UN staff members and other humanitarian workers who have paid the ultimate price. Full respect of international law and international humanitarian law by all sides is of paramount importance. We urge all sides to respect these principles and note that there must be accountability for violations of international law. The EU calls for the urgent implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2712 and supports its call for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip for a sufficient number of days to enable, consistent with international humanitarian law, full, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. The civilian population is in desperate need of more food, water, fuel, electricity and medical care, as well as safe shelter. We regret that since the end of the humanitarian pause, the entry of humanitarian aid has declined from already insufficient levels. Access to these necessities must be urgently restored at sufficient levels to address the very high level of need. And we call for establishing additional routes to bring in life-saving aid to Gaza. The EU stands ready to continue its support, while it has already increased its humanitarian aid to more than 100 million euros. The EU and its member states will continue to work closely with international partners, the UN and other agencies, as well as countries in the region. Mr. President, There is no justification for terror. The European Union has condemned in the strongest possible terms Hamas' brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel. Israel has the right to defend itself, in line with international law and international humanitarian law. All hostages must be immediately released, and ICRC must be granted access to them and allowed to bring them required medical support. The EU continues efforts with its partners to prevent regional escalation, and we continue to engage with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, as well as other regional and international partners to this end. We call on regional actors to refrain from any action that can further aggravate the situation. The Palestinian Authority must be supported by all members of the international community, and it must be reinvigorated to ultimately return to govern Gaza as the legitimate Palestinian governance body in charge of the whole occupied Palestinian territory. Democratic Palestinian institutions based on respect for the rule of law and human rights are vital for the Palestinian people. The EU deplores the increased extremist settler violence in the West Bank and recalls that Israel has the duty to protect civilians in the West Bank, to hold perpetrators accountable and ensure that the IDF intervenes. Furthermore, in line with the EU's commitment to implement Security Council Resolution 2334, and recalling that settlements are illegal under international law, constitute an obstacle to peace and threaten to make a two-state solution impossible, the EU reiterates its strong opposition to Israel's settlement policy and actions taken in this context. Mr. President, the EU underlines that the only sustainable solution that will bring security to the Middle East is peace. The European Union is ready to contribute to reviving a political process on the basis of the two-state solution, including through the Peace Day effort, and welcomes diplomatic peace and security initiatives, and supports the holding of an international peace conference soon. I thank you.
Agradezco a la excelente.
I thank Your Excellency, Madam Sampson, for your statement. There are no further speakers on the list. The meeting is adjourned.
What's a humanitarian deconfliction?
Deconfliction mechanism is something we have in place in conflict zones, whether in Syria, whether in Ukraine, and now in Gaza and other places, which means that we communicate to the warring parties, the UN movements of UN humanitarian movements, and also places where UN premises and shelters are.
Is it working? Okay. Israeli Ambassador Erdan also said, quote, that Israel has facilitated the construction of 2 field hospitals, one run by the Kingdom of Jordan, the other by the UAE. And then he also mentioned that France is coordinating a floating hospital. Is the UN aware of this, involved in any way?
We're aware. We know there were airdrops, I think, of the 2 field hospitals. We've seen the press reports and aware of the French hospital ship off the coast of Egypt. Yes, sir, and then we'll go to the screen.
Thank you.
Your microphone, please, close to your mouth.
Sorry. It's Labluan, sir, from Bangladesh Protiteam.
Yes.
Obviously, I ask about Bangladesh.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. United Nations will mark the 75th anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and the International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the Victims of the Crime of Genocide. We appreciate that. However, I regret to share with you that the United Nations is yet to take action to recognize the genocidal action committed by occupying force in Bangladesh during its liberation war in 1971. I'd like to hear your kind comments.
First of all, with all due respect to historical events and those who suffered in those historical events, I will not comment on things that happened that long ago. Second, as we've said here repeatedly over and over again, it is not for the Secretary General to designate an event as genocide. It is up to competent judicial authorities. So what is your other question?
Yeah, Bangladesh is committed to hold a free, fair, and inclusive election and would welcome all cooperation from democratic allies. Is United Nations planning to send observer in Bangladesh during its national election?
No, the United Nations in very recent, my memory, without a specific mandate, does no longer send observers.
Thank you.
Abdelhamid, then Mushfiq, and then Stefano.
Thank you, Stefan. I want to follow up with a question that my